The heir of ashes, the war began long before he was born. By the time the child opened his eyes to the fractured skies of the imperial homeworld, the great conflict with Earth had already consumed entire star systems. He was raised in marble chambers of silence, where tutors recited the glories of his ancestors and guards stood like statues, veiled in obsidian armor. His cradle was carved from the bones of a slain leviathan, his lullabies sung by choirs trained to never weep. Even as an infant, he was surrounded not by tenderness, but by ceremony, rituals designed to sculpt him into something greater than human, greater than child. But nothing, no script nor crown, could prepare him for the moment the throne fell upon his shoulders. Happened in a single night of fire. The Imperial fleet had launched a crushing offensive against the Earth Alliance in the Helios Belt, a cluster of mining colonies, burning with wealth and resistance. His father, the Emperor, led the armada himself, his banners unfurling across the void like blood-red wings. Yet pride is a fragile weapon. Humanity, smaller and weaker, struck with desperate cunning. They lured the Emperor into a labyrinth of fractured moons and detonated them, tearing apart the stars themselves. The boy watched from the high balconies of the crystal citadel, staring at the blackness beyond the palace glass. One moment, his father's presence filled the galaxy like a storm. The next, silence, a silence so vast it swallowed the child whole. The court announced the Emperor's death with voices of stone. No tears were shed. Mourning was forbidden for rulers. Instead, the high priest draped the boy in robes far too heavy for his thin shoulders, embroidered with galaxies in gold thread. A crown of jagged crystal pressed into his brow, cutting faint lines into his skin. He could barely lift his head beneath it, yet the generals bowed and said, "All hail the child monarch, all hail the sovereign flame." He was 12. 12, and inheriting an empire that stretched across 40 worlds, built on conquest, discipline, and fear. 12, and every decision he made would send thousands to die. They led him to the throne that night, a colossal seat carved from meteoric stone, black and cold beneath him. He sat high above the council chamber, the warlords standing below like jackals in armor. Their eyes did not look at him, not truly. They sought the ghost of his father in his features, measuring whether this child carried the same fire. He tried to straighten his spine the way his tutors had taught him. He tried to deepen his voice, to speak with the weight of command. But inside his heart was a frantic drum. He could still hear the echoes of his father's last words before departure. Rule with fire. Mercy is weakness. And never forget, they are vermin. The boy whispered the command he had been rehearsed to give. His voice cracked but carried through the chamber. Continue the war. A chorus of approval followed. Armor clashed, banners swayed, voices rose like thunder. The empire roared, but the child only felt smaller, shrinking into the stone. He had spoken the words, yet they tasted like ash on his tongue. That night, the palace corridors echoed differently. Without his father's shadow, every corner seemed colder. The ceremonial torches burned too brightly, throwing his child's face against the vast walls like a fragile silhouette. In his private chambers, the robes pooled around him like a drowning sea. He pulled them off and sat by the window, staring out at the stars. So many of those lights were already soaked in blood. He knew it in theory. His tutors had drilled into him the mathematics of conquest, the graphs of supply lines, the glory of victory songs. But knowing was different from feeling. That night, alone, he began to wonder what it meant to inherit an empire built on bones. He pressed his forehead against the glass and whispered, "I am Emperor." The words rang hollow. His reflection in the star window was not a ruler, it was just a boy, pale, frightened, with wide eyes that still dreamed of running in gardens he had never been allowed to play in. And yet, the empire did not pause for his doubt. The days that followed were a storm of war councils and ceremonies. He was paraded through the halls, forced to sit on the throne while warlords shouted strategies at each other. He signed decrees with hands that shook, ordering reinforcements to distant worlds he had never seen. He tasted the iron weight of command, but never its sweetness. Each night he wondered if his father had felt this fear, this crushing loneliness. Or had the fire been real? Had his father truly been the giant they all claimed him to be? Or was even the great emperor once just a child, trembling under robes too heavy for his frame? The boy never asked. To ask was weakness. Weeks turned into months. The Empire pressed harder against Earth, though victories cost more with each battle. Humanity was cunning. They did not fight with brute force, but with patience, ambush, and sacrifice. For every system the Empire burned, 2 new rebellions rose in the ashes. The boy listened in silence as reports poured in, fleets crippled, colonies starving, soldiers deserting. The warlords shouted for harsher measures. One demanded the obliteration of Earth's oceans. Another suggested enslaving entire colonies to fuel the war machine. They looked at the boy and waited for his decree. He nodded, pretending to understand. Pretending to rule. But when the warlords left, he lingered in the empty chamber staring at the throne room doors. He wanted to scream, to run, to throw off the crown and hide in the gardens he had glimpsed once through a palace gate. Yet each time the memory of his father's voice returned. Rule with fire. The boy swallowed his tears. And so the Empire burned brighter. It was inevitable that Earth would strike back. The raid came without warning, swift as lightning. Human warships pierced the outer defenses of the capital system, weaving through defenses with impossible precision. Alarms screamed across the citadel as fire streaked the skies. The boy was rushed to his flagship by guards, his robe dragging behind him across metal floors. The ship shuddered as it broke from orbit. Explosions blossomed in the distance. Imperial cruisers torn apart, towers collapsing into flame. Through the viewport, the boy saw his homeworld bleed light into the void. Fear rose in his throat like bile. He clutched the armrest of the command chair, fingers white against the steel. His generals barked orders, their voices drowning the thunder of battle. He was supposed to command, to inspire, but his lips would not move. He was still a boy, watching his world unravel. And then, in the chaos, the human ships closed in. Their weapons sliced through the Imperial flagship's shields, boarding craft slamming into its hull. The boy was pulled from his chair by guards, but too late. The walls shook. A hatch blew open. Figures in dark armor stormed the chamber. For the first time, the child monarch saw the faces of his enemies. They were not monsters, not vermin. They were men and women with fire in their eyes, wielding weapons with desperate courage. He expected death. Execution on the spot. Yet no blade struck. A voice rang out, calm, steady. Take him alive. And in that moment, the heir of ashes was no longer an emperor. He was a prisoner. The burden of a throne. The boy was 12 years old when his empire abandoned him. The humans did not kill him. That was the first astonishment. As the boarding parties dragged him through the ruined corridors of his flagship, smoke and sparks spitting from the ceilings, he clenched his eyes shut, waiting for the shot that would end it. Instead, strong hands bound his wrists and he was shoved into a chamber humming with alien engines. The hatch sealed. The ship jolted forward. His empire was behind him now, a bleeding planet, a fleet collapsing into ruin, and the phantom crown of his father dissolving into smoke. For the first time, he was alone. But this was not the loneliness of palace chambers or echoing throne rooms. This was different. A loneliness without ritual, without banners, without the crushing weight of generals at his side. Here, in the bowels of an enemy ship, stripped of robes and crown, he was simply a child in chains. He did not yet know that this was the beginning of something greater than rulership. He thought instead of how ashamed his father would be. The humans confined him in a stark chamber, walls of dull steel, floor bare and cold. No silks, no crystal light, no servants to bow when he lifted his gaze. A single cot clung to the wall. A single tray of food rested in the corner. He stared at it, bewildered. In the Empire, meals were feasts of spectacle, flames leaping from platters, servants kneeling in lines, music swelling with each course. Here the food was simple. Bread, fruit, a bowl of broth steaming faintly. His stomach gnawed with hunger, but his pride sealed his lips. He would not eat their scraps. He was an emperor. Hours passed. The hunger worsened. Finally, trembling hands reached for the bread. He ate in silence, each bite tasting of humiliation. In those moments, he realized that his throne had been more fragile than he ever knew. A single defeat, a single captured ship, and he was reduced to this. Bare feet on steel floors, robe replaced by rough fabric, crown vanished. What was an emperor without his empire? The days blurred. No interrogators came. No torturers. Only guards, silent, faceless, watching him through the small window in the door. He tried to stand tall when they passed, tried to remember the lessons drilled into him. Never show weakness. Never let the enemy see your fear. But at night, when the ship's hum lulled the chamber into stillness, the child inside the monarch awoke. He curled into himself on the cot, clutching the thin blanket, staring at the ceiling until his eyes burned. He replayed the last glimpse of his world, the towers burning, the fleet crumbling, his people abandoned. He wondered if they cursed his name now. He wondered if they still called him Emperor. On the fourth day, the door hissed open. A man stepped inside. He was not like the generals of the Empire, not armored nor draped in banners. His uniform was plain, marked only by the insignia of Earth's fleet. His hair was streaked with gray, his face weathered but calm. His eyes did not burn with triumph or hatred. They studied the boy quietly, the way one studies a storm cloud, aware of its danger but also its fragility. The boy straightened, summoning all the steel he had left. "I am the sovereign flame," he declared, though his voice faltered. "The Emperor of the Stars. You will kneel." The man did not kneel. He did not even raise his weapon. He only crossed the room, pulled a chair from the corner, and sat. "My name is Captain Elias Ren," he said. His voice was low, steady, like a river flowing through stone. "I'll be the one watching over you." The boy's throat tightened. Watching over? Not executing? Not parading him before Earth as a trophy? Confusion sparked anger. He slammed his fists against his knees. "You dare speak to me as if I am a prisoner? I am your conqueror, your master." "You are a child," Elias said softly. The words sliced deeper than any blade. The boy did not speak again that day. Or the next. But his mind was restless, caught in the contradiction. Why was he alive? Why did this captain not curse him? Not strike him down for the fleets his empire had slaughtered? Why was his chamber quiet, his meals simple but clean? It unsettled him more than cruelty would have. He had been raised to expect hatred. Mercy was a weapon he had never learned to defend against. In the weeks that followed, Elias returned often. Sometimes he brought books, thick alien tomes filled with languages the boy struggled to decipher. Sometimes he brought nothing, only his silence. He did not lecture nor demand. He only sat watching, patient as the tide. The boy tried to resist. He shouted titles, recited decrees, reminded Elias of the punishments that would fall upon Earth once the Empire reclaimed him. Yet each time Elias only answered with quiet eyes and the same words. "You are a child." At first the words enraged him, but slowly, painfully, they began to hollow something inside. Because in the stillness of his nights the boy could no longer deny the truth. He was not his father. He was not the fire. He was 12. One evening, when the stars wheeled like silver fire outside the viewport, the boy asked a question he had never dared voice before. His tone was hesitant, stripped of the Emperor's mask. "Why am I alive?" Elias did not answer immediately. He leaned back in the chair, hands folded, studying the boy with that same unreadable calm. "Because death teaches nothing," Elias said at last. "But life can change everything." The boy frowned. His empire had always spoken of strength as the only truth, of death as the only justice. Life was only fuel for the throne, for the fleet, for the endless fire. Life as lesson? The thought gnawed at him long after Elias left. In time, whispers of the war reached even his chamber. Guards spoke in hushed tones beyond the door. Battles fought, victories claimed, losses endured. He listened, piecing fragments together. Humanity had struck blows deeper than his empire had ever expected. Systems once unquestioned now teetered on rebellion. The war was not ending. It was changing. And in the heart of that storm, the child sat alone, clutching questions too heavy for his small frame. Was he still an emperor? Or only a boy dressed in ashes? He did not yet know that the burden of the throne would soon shift, not from the weight of robes and crowns, but from the weight of truth. A truth that would break him, a truth that would save him. The fall of the emperor. The boy had always been told that emperors did not fall. They ascended, they blazed, they conquered. They might die in fire, but never in shame. The empire's histories were a hymn to permanence, written in victories and etched in blood. Yet now, locked in a quiet chamber aboard a human warship, he began to understand the truth. Even emperors could vanish into silence, forgotten and irrelevant. The empire believed him dead. He overheard it in fragments, guard whispers, Passing reports, a technician's muttered sigh. To the vast machinery of his empire, he was gone, swallowed by battle. No search parties, no fleets scouring the stars for their lost monarch. His throne stood empty, and the warlords filled the vacuum with their claws. He was no longer an emperor. He was a ghost. The realization shattered something fragile inside him. For days he sat unmoving, staring at the steel floor. He ate little, spoke less. The boy who had demanded kneeling, who had proclaimed himself sovereign flame, now felt the ember inside him flicker to nothing. It was not captivity that broke him. It was abandonment. The Empire had crowned him with fire and then left him to burn alone. Captain Elias Ren knew. He saw it in the boy's posture, in the way his small shoulders sagged as though the universe itself pressed down upon them. Elias did not press questions nor offer false comfort. He simply entered the chamber, sat in his chair, and kept the silence company. The boy hated him for it. And yet, secretly, he needed it. There were nights when the silence cracked, when the boy's voice slipped out, fragile and unguarded. "Do they speak of me?" he asked once, eyes fixed on the stars outside the viewport. "Do they curse my name? Or have they already chosen another?" Elias had not answered. His silence was not cruelty but honesty. And the boy understood. He was forgotten. The humans debated his fate. He learned this too, in pieces, snatches of conversation carried by air ducts, whispers from guards who underestimated a child's listening ears. Some in Earth's council demanded his execution. "He is the symbol of their empire," one voice declared. "Cut off the head and the body weakens." Others argued he should be used as a bargaining chip, ransom him for peace or at least for breathing room. Still others feared him. He is young now, yes, but what seed are we planting if we let him live? The boy absorbed every word. Each argument was a knife twisting deeper. To them, he was not a ruler, not even a person. He was leverage. He was danger. He was a child-shaped weapon whose existence itself threatened galaxies. And yet, amidst the storm of suspicion, one voice was constant. Elias's. "Death teaches nothing," Elias had said. "He is not the Empire. He is a child." The boy clung to those words in secret. He told himself he hated Elias, told himself the captain was weak, foolish, soft. But deep inside, a part of him ached at the possibility that someone, anyone, saw him not as a weapon, not as a symbol, but simply as what he was. One night, sleep abandoned him. He wandered to the viewport of his chamber, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The stars wheeled silently beyond. So many of them had burned under his empire's hand. So many still smoldered. He thought of the villages razed to silence, of the rebel colonies crushed, of the oceans poisoned. He had signed those decrees with a trembling hand, parroting the words his warlords placed before him. At 12, he had ordered deaths in numbers he could not comprehend. And yet, staring out at the infinite night, he began to imagine faces. Not numbers, not vermin as his father had called them. Faces, like his own. For the first time, guilt crawled into his chest. The following day, Elias entered and found the boy slumped on the cot, eyes hollow. "Why do they not kill me?" the boy asked, voice raw. Elias studied him, then said, "Because some believe you can still learn." "Learn?" The boy's lips curled. "I am the one who commands learning, the one who decrees history." Elias's eyes softened. "History is not decreed. It is lived. And you haven't lived enough yet to know what kind you'll leave behind." The boy looked away, but the words burrowed deep. Soon after, the humans moved him. His chamber was emptied, the cot stripped, his wrists bound again. Guards escorted him through the ship's spine to a larger hall, its walls alive with the pulse of machinery. There, he met humanity's council. They appeared not as towering warlords, but as men and women with weary eyes and hollow cheeks. Their uniforms rumpled with long nights. Screens flickered with maps of battles, casualty lists, images of ruined cities. They studied the child as though he were some strange relic dredged from a battlefield. The boy tried to summon his father's fire. He lifted his chin, forced the words through cracked lips. "I am your emperor. You will regret what you do today." The council did not tremble. One woman leaned forward, her voice cold. "You are no emperor here. You are a child whose people have burned our worlds." The boy's chest heaved, his voice rising in desperation. "You cannot kill me." My empire will avenge me. Another counselor shook his head. Your empire believes you dead. They have already moved on. The word struck like a blade. The boy staggered, swallowing against the sudden void in his throat. His empire had not come for him. His generals had not scoured the stars. He was alone, utterly. He wanted to scream, to deny it, but his body betrayed him. His knees buckled. He crumpled to the floor, small and shaking, the robe of his borrowed dignity pooling around him. For the first time, he looked less like an emperor and more like what he was, a child. Silence filled the hall. Even the counselors, hardened by war, seemed unsettled by the sight. And then Elias spoke, his voice steady. Do you see? He is not the throne. He is not the fire. He is just a boy. And boys can change. The council debated for hours. In the end, they did not execute him. Nor did they ransom him. Instead, they gave Elias custody. If you believe he can change, one counselor said, then prove it. Teach him. Show him the weight of what he carries. But if he fails, his blood will be on your hands. The decision sealed his fate. The child was no longer emperor, no longer prisoner. He was something stranger, a student. As he was led back to his chamber, his mind reeled. The throne was gone. His empire was gone. Even the certainty of execution had dissolved. What remained was an emptiness, vast and terrifying. Yet in that emptiness, something faint stirred, an ember not of fire, but of possibility. He did not yet know it. But the fall of the emperor was the birth of the boy. The captain's oath, the council's words echoed long after the chamber emptied. Teach him. Show him the weight of what he carries. If he fails, his blood will be on your hands. For Elias Ren, it was more than a task. It was an oath. He had lived too long in the shadow of this war. His youth had been burned away on the edges of battlefields, watching comrades buried under alien fire, seeing colonies reduced to rubble. He had no children of his own. War had stolen that chance from him. And now fate, in its strange cruelty, had placed a child into his care. Not just any child, but the boy who bore the empire's crown. Elias had every reason to hate him. Yet when he looked at the boy, he did not see a sovereign flame or a tyrant in waiting. He saw fragility hidden behind the brittle mask of arrogance. He saw eyes too young to have signed decrees of slaughter. He saw a child who had been taught to rule before he had ever learned to live, and Elias vowed to teach him, not as a weapon, nor as a prisoner, but as a boy who might still learn what it meant to be human. The boy did not make it easy. When Elias first entered the chamber with a tray of food, the child's chin lifted high, his voice sharp with rehearsed authority. You will kneel when you address me. Elias placed the tray on the small metal table. Bread, fruit, a cup of water, nothing more. He sat in the chair across from the cot, unhurried. I don't kneel, he said simply. The boy's eyes narrowed. You are speaking to your emperor. No, Elias said, tearing a piece of bread and eating it. I'm speaking to a boy. The boy flushed with fury. I will have you executed when I return to my throne. Elias chewed quietly, swallowed, and set the bread down. If you wish to rule one day, you'd better learn to eat first. The silence that followed was unbearable. The boy's stomach betrayed him, growling in the hush. Finally, trembling hands reached for the fruit. He ate in small, bitter bites, glaring at Elias all the while. The captain said nothing. He only watched, steady as stone. The lessons began without fanfare. Elias never declared them as such. He only lived them, letting the boy witness. When crew members passed in the corridor, Elias greeted each one by name. The boy watched, confused. Why do you speak to them so? He asked one day. They are beneath you, soldiers, servants. They are people, Elias replied. They bleed the same as I do. They keep this ship alive. Without them, I am nothing, the boy scoffed. An emperor commands. He does not need to thank the hands that obey. Elias only smiled faintly. Then perhaps that is why your empire is crumbling. The words struck harder than any blade. The boy retreated to silence, but the seed was planted. Days bled into weeks. Elias took him beyond the chamber, guarded but unshackled. They walked the length of the ship. The boy saw soldiers repairing bulkheads scarred by battle, engineers coaxing life from battered engines, medics tending to the wounded. None bowed to him. None whispered his titles. They looked at him with wary eyes, some with open disdain, but none with the fear he had been taught to expect. And yet, None harmed him either. It unsettled him. In his empire, fear was the currency of survival. But here among the humans there was something different holding them together. It was not fear. It was something else, something he could not yet name. One evening Elias took him to the med bay. Rows of cots stretched into the dim light, soldiers wrapped in bandages, faces pale with pain. The boy froze at the threshold. He had seen death before, but always from the safe distance of palace balconies or the filtered images presented to him by generals. Never this close. Never where the groans of suffering pressed against his chest. A young woman lay nearby, her arm bound in gauze, her breath shallow. She turned her head and met his eyes. For a moment he saw no hatred there, only exhaustion. "Who is he?" she whispered to Elias. "A boy," Elias answered. The boy's lips parted, but no words came. He wanted to declare himself emperor, to summon the mask of command. But the sound of her labored breathing silenced him. He turned away, trembling. That night he could not sleep. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, hearing again the chorus of pain from the medbay. For the first time, the war did not sound like victory hymns. It sounded like suffering. The next day, the boy asked Elias a question that startled them both. "Why do you fight us?" His voice carried not arrogance, but genuine confusion. Elias looked at him steadily. "Because your empire burned our worlds. Because we wanted to live." The boy hesitated. "That is what my father taught me. That conquest is survival. That only fire endures." "And do you believe him?" Elias asked. The boy opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time, he did not have an answer. Weeks turned to months. Slowly, the boy's defiance softened. He still spoke of thrones and titles, but less often. He still bristled when the crew ignored his heritage, but sometimes, just sometimes, he listened instead of commanding. Elias saw it, the fragile beginnings of humility. It was not surrender. It was not defeat. It was the faintest spark of change. One evening, as stars drifted past the viewport, the boy sat with Elias in uncharacteristic quiet. His small hands twisted in his lap, restless. Finally, he whispered, "If I am not emperor, then what am I?" Elias regarded him for a long moment. "You are what you choose to become." The boy's brow furrowed. "But I was born to rule." Elias shook his head. "No one is born to rule. We are born to learn. Ruling comes after." The boy fell silent, the words heavy on his heart. He stared out at the endless night, wondering if perhaps the stars themselves could hear his uncertainty. For Elias, this was enough. Not victory, not transformation, not yet, but enough. A boy who once declared himself sovereign flame was now asking questions. And questions, Elias knew, were the beginning of wisdom. The oath he had taken, to teach, to guide, to show the boy the weight of what he carried, was only beginning. The road ahead was treacherous, fragile, uncertain, but Elias Ren had seen empires rise and fall. He had seen armies break and kings burn, and he believed against all reason that this child could be different, not because of bloodlines, not because of crowns, but because deep down, beneath the ashes of arrogance, there was still a boy waiting to learn how to be human, and Elias had sworn he would not let that ember die. First sparks of humility. The boy awoke to the hum of the human ship, a sound alien to him yet strangely soothing. His own vessels were designed to roar, to echo dominance through every rivet and beam, so that no one aboard could forget the Empire's might. But here, aboard the Resolute, silence reigned. The walls were plain. The light was soft. There were no golden crests, no banners fluttering with the imperial sigil, only steel, clean and unassuming. It enraged him. He rose from the narrow bed, his imperial robes long since taken and replaced with simple gray garments. To him they felt like shackles, each thread a reminder of his stolen throne. He stood tall, at least as tall as his young frame could allow, and waited for the door to open as it always did at dawn. Captain Elias Ren entered, carrying nothing more than a tray with food. The smell was plain: bread, fruit, a bowl of broth. No spices from 7 worlds. No sweetmeats soaked in nectar. Just human fare. The boy scowled. "I am the emperor of the stars," he declared, his voice sharp, rehearsed. "I will not eat the scraps of slaves." Elias set the tray down without meeting the boy's eyes. His movements were steady, practiced, utterly unmoved. He neither bowed nor scoffed, he simply existed in quiet defiance of the boy's title. Eat or don't, Elias said. His tone was not cruel, not mocking, merely factual, as though the Emperor's hunger were his own choice and no one else's concern. The boy's fists tightened. In his palace, servants would have fallen to their knees begging forgiveness for even delaying his meal. Here, no one seemed to care. His words, his name, his throne, all echoed into silence. "I will not," the child repeated, though his stomach twisted at the smell of warm bread. Elias glanced at him then, only for a moment. His eyes were lined with years of battles the boy could not yet fathom. They were not the eyes of a conqueror nor of a servant. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by crowns. "Then you will be hungry," the captain replied, and left without another word. By the second day, the boy's defiance wavered. Hunger gnawed at his pride. He had been raised to believe weakness was death, that bending was betrayal. Yet when Elias entered again, setting down another tray with the same simple meal, the boy felt his body betray him. His hands trembled toward the food. He stopped, glaring at Elias as if daring him to smirk, to laugh, to remind him of the humiliation. But Elias did none of that. He merely stood waiting, calm as stone. The boy ate, slowly at first as though each bite were poison, then faster, driven by need. Elias watched without comment. It unsettled the boy more than mockery would have. On the third day, the Emperor tried a new tactic. "You should kneel before me," he said, crumbs still on his lips. "Even in chains, I am greater than you." Elias's brow furrowed, not in anger but in thought. "Greater?" he repeated as though testing the word. He leaned forward, arms resting on his knees. "What is greater, boy? The crown on your head or the choices you make when no crown is there?" The boy stiffened. No one had ever spoken to him like this, not advisors, not generals, not even his father. His father's words had been fire and iron, commands carved into his soul. Show no weakness. Rule with fear. Trust no one. Yet here was a man who did not bow, who did not curse, who did not even raise his voice. A man who treated him not as an emperor nor as an enemy, but as something he had nearly forgotten he was. A child. That night, the boy lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts circled endlessly. In his empire, respect had always been shouted, demanded, enforced with whips and blades. Here, aboard this enemy vessel, respect seemed to grow from something quieter, something invisible. Elias commanded without roaring, obeyed without cruelty. Soldiers saluted him not out of fear, but out of something else, something the boy had no word for. It stung worse than hunger. Because in the silence of the human ship, a truth began to creep into him like frost. For all his titles, for all his robes, he had never truly been obeyed, only feared. The days stretched on and his defiance weakened into curiosity. He still declared himself emperor, still demanded honors, but with less venom in his tone. Sometimes Elias did not even answer. Other times he asked questions in return, piercing ones that left the boy uneasy. "What is an emperor without people?" Elias once asked, cleaning a small dagger at the table. "What is a throne without trust?" The boy had no answer. It was in the infirmary that the first spark truly lit. Elias brought him there one evening, saying little. The boy followed reluctantly, half expecting some human trick. But as the door slid open, the stench of medicine and the quiet cries of pain filled the air. Rows of wounded soldiers lay in beds, some missing limbs, others shrouded in bandages. Human medics moved between them, whispering comfort, tending to wounds with hands steady despite exhaustion. And then the boy saw it. An alien among them. One of his own people. A captured soldier, wounded, pale. Yet he was not tortured, not executed. He was being cared for. A human nurse pressing cloth to his wounds, speaking to him in broken fragments of the Empire's language. The boy froze. His empire would never show such mercy. Prisoners were tools, pawns, examples to inspire fear. Yet here, his soldier was treated no different than the humans around him. He wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but no words came. His throat ached with something he could not name. Elias watched him quietly, then whispered almost too softly to hear. "Tell me, Emperor, who is greater, the one who rules by fear or the one who heals his enemy?" That night the boy did not sleep. He sat awake, knees drawn to his chest, his small frame swallowed by the plain gray garments. For the first time, doubt cracked the armor of certainty that had shielded him since the crown was placed upon his head. He had always believed greatness was in conquest, in the roar of ships, in the trembling of subjects. Yet the humans, these fragile, flawed creatures, seemed to carry greatness in silence, in kindness, in humility. The boy hated the thought, and yet he could not unsee it. The first spark had been lit. Lessons of humanity. The days aboard the Resolute grew into weeks, and the child emperor found his anger harder to summon. Hunger had broken his pride, but it was Elias's silence that unraveled it further. The captain never raised his voice, never sneered, never once acknowledged the titles the boy shouted into the air. It was as though Elias saw through the robes that were no longer there, past the crown that had been stripped from his head, to something smaller and more fragile, something the boy himself had long forgotten existed. Yet Elias did not lecture him, not openly. Instead, he led him places, showed him things, let the boy's own eyes betray the Empire's illusions. Their first stop was the refugee ward. The boy had walked past the door dozens of times before, guarded by Marines in quiet steel. He had assumed it was some holding cell, some barracks. But when Elias motioned for him to follow and the door hissed open, a new world unfolded before him. Inside, hundreds of civilians lay scattered across makeshift cots. Children clutching threadbare dolls, their faces smudged with ash. Mothers with hollow eyes holding babies who whimpered from hunger. Old men staring at walls with the emptiness of those who had lost entire worlds. The boy stopped in the doorway, his chest tightening. The air smelled of smoke and medicine, a sharp tang that clawed at his throat. "These are the survivors," Elias said softly. "From Villara. One of your fleets burned the city when they refused tribute." The boy flinched. He knew the name Villara. His generals had spoken of it proudly, a nest of rebels cleansed by fire. They had presented it as a victory, a reminder that resistance against the Empire was futile. But here, in rows of cots, he saw the victory for what it was: widows, orphans, the limbless and broken. He wanted to look away, but a child's eyes caught his, a girl no older than himself. Her arm wrapped in gauze, her face scarred. She stared at him without recognition, without hate, only with the hollow vacancy of one who had seen too much. The boy turned and stumbled back into the hallway, his breath sharp, his body trembling. "Why did you show me this?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Because you must see," Elias replied. His tone was not triumphant, not cruel. It was heavy with something deeper, sorrow perhaps. "You were told war makes you mighty. This is what war makes, boy. Ashes." The next day, Elias took him to the ruins. Through the viewport of a transport shuttle, earth spread beneath them like a scarred jewel. Once blue oceans now ran murky with oil. Forests burned in patches, leaving black wounds across continents. Cities lay in ruin, their skeletal towers clawing skyward. They descended to a place once called Novaterra, a city the Empire had bombed in retaliation for resistance. The boy had heard of this too. It was described in court as a necessary measure, a demonstration of imperial strength. Now he walked its streets, or what was left of them. The ground crunched with glass. Rubble stretched as far as his eyes could see. The air carried the acrid stench of fire that would never quite fade. A stray dog limped through the wreckage. The boy froze, realizing he had never seen an animal outside a gilded cage. The creature's ribs showed, its gait uneven, yet it carried on, scavenging for scraps among the ruins. Something twisted in his chest. He had been told Earth was a barbarian world, its people unworthy of respect. Yet in its ruins he saw not barbarians but survivors. "Why show me this?" he whispered again, softer this time. Elias's reply came like a blade sliding quietly between armor plates. "Because one day you must choose what kind of ruler you will be. One who makes ruins, or one who rebuilds them." At night the boy's dreams turned fevered. He saw his father's face, stern, unyielding, crowned with fire. "Rule with fear," the voice thundered. "Crush them before they crush you. An emperor bends to no one." But the images shifted, and he saw the girl in the refugee ward, her vacant eyes burning into him. He saw the dog limping through rubble. He saw Elias standing silent beside him. No crown, no throne, yet commanding more loyalty with a glance than his father ever had with entire armies. The boy woke sweating, heart pounding. For the first time in his short life, he doubted the voice of his blood. As days bled into one another, he began asking questions. Tentative at first, then sharper, desperate. Why don't your soldiers fear you? Because fear doesn't last, Elias said. Respect does. Why did you heal my soldier instead of killing him? Because mercy plants seeds that cruelty cannot. Why do you fight us at all if you believe in mercy? Elias's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. Because we were given no choice. The boy fell silent, shame curling inside him. Something inside him cracked further the day Elias brought him to the war memorial. It was a simple hall of stone and steel, unadorned yet lined with names etched into the walls. Thousands, tens of thousands, each letter a wound preserved in memory. Soldiers stood silently before the inscriptions, hands pressed against names of brothers, sisters, children. The boy wandered down the corridor, reading the endless rows, until he found himself standing before a smaller wall marked for civilians. Among the names was a family of 5, their surname repeating down the line. They were from Nova Terra. Elias said quietly, "Oh, mother, father, and 3 children. They were vaporized when your fleet fired on their home." The boy's knees nearly gave way. The weight of the crown he no longer wore pressed down on him like a mountain. For the first time he whispered words he had never spoken in his life. "I didn't know." "No emperor ever does," Elias murmured. "Not until he chooses to open his eyes." That night the boy did not dream of crowns or fire. He dreamed of ashes and silence. He dreamed of eyes that watched him not with loyalty, not with hatred, but with expectation. It terrified him more than war ever had. For buried within the silence of the human ship, beneath the weight of ruins and names carved into stone, a seed had been planted, a seed of doubt, a seed of humility, a seed of change. And though the boy tried to smother it, he could feel it growing. The breaking point. The boy sat alone in his quarters, knees tucked against his chest, staring at the reflection of his face in the darkened viewport. The hum of the Resolute's engines thrummed beneath the floor, steady and unchanging, a heartbeat of steel. Yet inside him everything was chaos. He had seen too much. The refugee ward, the scarred children, the ruins of Nova Terra, the endless names carved into the stone of the memorial. But louder than all of it were the voices in his mind. His father's voice, deep and commanding, thundered with every breath. "Rule with fire. Rule with fear. Bend the stars to your will or be swallowed by them." It was the creed drilled into him since birth. The creed of survival, of power, of empire. And yet, woven against it, soft as smoke but persistent as dawn, was Elias's voice. Fear doesn't last. Respect does. Mercy plants seeds that cruelty cannot. What kind of ruler do you want to be? The boy clutched at his ears as if he could silence both ghosts by force, but they remained warring inside him, father against captain, past against possibility. He remembered the coronation, the robes of flame draped across his thin shoulders, the crown so heavy it dug into his scalp. He had stood before 1,000 kneeling courtiers, his small hands gripping the scepter, pretending not to shake. "You are the empire now," his father's advisors had told him. "You must show no weakness. You must be their fire," and he had tried. He had sat upon the throne, his feet not even touching the floor, issuing decrees he barely understood. He had stared down generals twice his height, speaking words of war his father would have approved of, while inside he longed only to run. He had never been a child. He had been a crown with a boy beneath it, but here aboard the Resolute, Elias treated him as nothing more, or less, than what he truly was. One evening, after another restless day of pacing his quarters, the boy burst out in anger when Elias arrived with supper. "You speak of mercy and respect," he snapped. "But what has it earned you? Your world lies in ruins. Your cities are ash. My empire still stretches across 1,000 stars." His voice cracked, high-pitched and desperate, like a child trying to convince himself of a lie. Elias did not answer at first. He set the tray down, poured water into a cup, and finally met the boy's eyes. "Your empire stretches," he said evenly. "Yes, but do your people love you?" The boy faltered. "They fear me." "They must." Elias shook his head slowly. "Fear breaks. Fear flees. Fear turns against you the moment you falter. Love, respect, those endure." The boy slammed his fist against the table, bread scattering. "You don't understand. If I do not rule with fire, they will devour me. I am only a child." His voice cracked again, this time with something Elias had never heard from him before. Not anger, Not arrogance, but fear. Elias's gaze softened. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. And what if I told you, child, that the greatest leaders the galaxy has ever known began as children who admitted their fear? Leadership is not the absence of fear. It is the courage to choose mercy even when you are afraid. The boy's lip trembled. He turned away, unable to look Elias in the eye. His small hands shook as he clenched them into fists. That night the breaking point came. He dreamed again of his father, standing tall upon the throne of fire. You are my son. You are the Empire. You must burn them all. The boy trembled. But they suffer. The humans suffer. Their suffering is strength. It is your strength. Rule with fire. Then Elias appeared beside the throne, not in splendor, but in simple gray, as he always was. His presence was calm, steady. Rule with mercy, Elias said softly. Rule so that no child has to suffer as you do. The boy clutched his head, torn between the two. I don't know who I am, he screamed. And in the dream, his father's crown fell to the ground, shattering into shards of flame. The boy awoke in a cold sweat, tears streaking his face. For the first time in years he wept. Not as an emperor, not as a prisoner, but as a child. Elias found him the next morning sitting on the floor by the viewport, knees drawn tight to his chest. The boy's face was pale, eyes red-rimmed. I don't want to be fire anymore, the boy whispered. His voice was so quiet Elias almost didn't hear it. I don't want to burn everything I touch. Elias crouched beside him. Then don't. But I don't know how to be anything else. You'll learn. Elias's hand rested gently on the boy's shoulder. And if you choose to, you won't learn it alone. The boy swallowed hard, his throat aching. He wanted to believe. He wanted desperately to believe. But in his mind, his father's shadow still loomed large, whispering promises of fire. The breaking point had come. The boy was no longer the emperor he once declared himself to be. But he was not yet the leader Elias believed he could become. He was caught in the space between ash and flame, crown and child, fear and hope. And the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which path he would choose. The seed of change. The boy did not rise when Elias entered his quarters the next morning. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his robe of gray pooling around his thin frame, his eyes fixed on the metal beneath his hands. For once, he did not announce himself as emperor. He did not demand respect or titles. He simply asked in a small voice, "What makes a good ruler?" Elias paused in the doorway, tray of food in his hands. The question was not shouted. It was not a demand. It was the first question the boy had asked, not as a monarch, but as a learner. Setting the tray down gently, Elias lowered himself to sit across from him. A good ruler, he said, is one who serves. The boy's head jerked up, eyes wide. Serves? How can an emperor serve? It is the people who serve him. That is what you were taught, Elias said, calm and steady as stone. But it is a lie. A ruler who demands service is a tyrant. A ruler who gives service is a leader. The boy frowned, chewing on the words as though they were bitter. Yet he did not dismiss them. For the first time he allowed them space inside his mind. In the days that followed, he began to ask more. Why do your soldiers follow you, if not out of fear? Because they know I would give my life for them. Why do your people fight if they could surrender? Because some things are worth more than life. Dignity, home, hope. Why do you care for the weak? In my empire, they are discarded. Because strength means nothing if it is not used to protect. The boy absorbed the answers like a parched desert drinking rain. Each one unsettled him, yet also fed something long starved inside him, a part of him that had always wondered if there was more than fire and crowns. One morning, Elias brought him to the training deck. Soldiers sparred with wooden staves, their sweat dripping onto the padded floor. Their laughter rang in the air, sharp and genuine, even as they struck and stumbled. The boy watched in silence, bewildered. In the Empire, drills were brutal. Soldiers trained with live blades under the eyes of overseers, punishment delivered swiftly for even the smallest falter. Here mistakes were met with laughter, corrections, encouragement. Why do they laugh? The boy asked, his brow furrowing. Because they trust one another, Elias replied. They know they will not be killed for a mistake. They know their commander wants them strong, not broken. The boy felt something strange tug at him. Envy. That night he dreamed again, but not of his father's fire. Instead, he dreamed of sparring with Elias's soldiers, stumbling and falling, and hearing laughter, not cruel but warm, arms reaching down to help him rise again. When he woke, he found himself smiling faintly. It startled him so much that he touched his lips as though checking the expression was truly his own. The next day, Elias set a wooden stave in the boy's hands. The child blinked down at it. "You want me to fight?" "To learn," Elias said. The boy's grip was awkward, his stance clumsy. When Elias corrected him, guiding his small hands, the boy flushed with shame. He wanted to cast the stave aside, to declare himself too great for such childish fumbling. But something in Elias's gaze held him steady. Not mockery, not pity, but patience. And so he tried again. And again, until sweat beaded on his brow, his arms ached, and his breath came ragged. He had never been so weak, so uncoordinated, so human. When at last he collapsed, Elias handed him water. "Every emperor," he said, "must learn first to be a student." The boy drank deeply, the water tasting like victory, though not the kind he had been raised to crave. It was small moments, fragile yet relentless, that chipped away at him. The nurse who greeted him with a smile each time he passed the infirmary, though she knew he was the son of her enemy. The soldier who taught him how to knot his new boots when he fumbled, saying nothing, only showing with patient hands. The cook who gave him an extra piece of bread, sliding it onto his tray without a word. Each act was insignificant alone. Together they formed a chorus he could no longer ignore. Here, even he, the boy who had ordered their destruction, was given kindness. He began to wonder, what would it be like to rule in such a way that kindness was not an act of rebellion, but the foundation of all things? One evening, as the stars wheeled outside the viewport, the boy turned to Elias with a question that had been growing inside him for days. If I wanted to rule differently," he whispered, "how would I begin?" Elias studied him, his lined face unreadable for a long moment. At last he said, "You begin by listening. You begin by admitting you don't have all the answers. And you begin by serving one person, one choice at a time." The boy nodded slowly, the words sinking into him like seeds. He did not know yet what they would grow into. But for the first time he wanted to find out. The transformation was not complete. Shadows of his father's voice still haunted him, urging him to seize, to burn, to rule with fire. But now another voice existed within him too. Quieter but persistent, Elias's voice. The voice of humility. And for the first time, the boy allowed that voice not just to echo, but to guide. The seed of change had been planted, and already it was beginning to grow. Return to the Empire. The summons came like a storm breaking over calm seas. One morning, the horizon shimmered with the pale silhouette of imperial dreadnoughts, vast as floating citadels, their hulls burning with the insignia of the boy's bloodline. They came not as invaders, but as retrieval. The child's people had discovered where he was being kept, and they would not allow their emperor, however young, to remain in the hands of an enemy. The soldiers of Elias's fleet stood tense at their stations. Weapons were primed, shields raised. Yet Elias knew this was no battle they could win. Not against a dozen imperial dreadnoughts armed with weapons that could unmake worlds. And so he sent a message. "We will return him." The boy did not protest. He sat quietly as Elias entered his quarters. The once arrogant monarch now wore the expression of someone far older, someone carrying a weight too large for his thin frame. "They've come for me," he said softly. "They have," Elias replied. The boy's gaze lingered on the floor, his fingers curling into his robes. "I don't want to go." The admission shocked even himself. His palace had been a prison, yes, but it was his prison. His throne had been heavy, his crown burning, yet it was all he had known. And now, for the first time, he knew what freedom tasted like. Laughter in training halls, bread shared in silence, water given without fear. Elias knelt before him, steady hands resting on the boy's shoulders. "You will go, because it is your place to lead your people, but how you lead, that is now your choice." The boy looked up, eyes wide and afraid. "What if I fail? What if my father's voice is stronger than yours?" "Then fail," Elias said simply. "Fail and rise again. A ruler is not measured by never falling. He is measured by what he chooses each time he stands." The day of departure arrived. The Imperial boarding party swept into the ship with armored precision, their commander bowing low before the boy. "Your Radiance," the man intoned. "Your Empire awaits." The boy hesitated before answering. His eyes flicked to Elias standing behind the soldiers, a silent sentinel. For a moment he wanted to cling to him, to refuse, to beg for more time. But Elias's gaze, calm and unwavering, urged him forward. And so he straightened his back, nodded once, and walked with the commander. His steps were not steady, but they were his own. The Empire had changed in his absence, or perhaps it was he who had changed. The moment he stepped aboard the dreadnought, the old weight returned, attendants bowing, generals kneeling, servants averting their eyes. Every corridor echoed with silence, polished and cold. He sat once more upon the throne of fire, the crown of light searing against his brow. And yet it no longer fit, not because it had shrunk, but because he had grown. Where once he had felt power coursing through him, now he felt only distance. The gulf between ruler and ruled stretched before him, vast and unbridgeable. His advisors pressed him for decrees. His generals demanded orders. His courtiers whispered in his ears, telling him of rebellions to crush, enemies to burn, laws to tighten. The boy listened, silent, his small hands gripping the armrests of the throne. His father's voice hissed in his mind, urging him to answer with fire and command. But another voice lingered too, Elias's voice, patient and steady. A ruler serves, and so when at last he spoke, his words fell like stones into still water. "No more burnings," he said. "No more executions for hunger. Bring the farmers food. Bring the sick medicine. Let no child be struck for weakness." The chamber erupted in shock. Courtiers gasped. Generals exchanged furious glances. Advisors bent low as though they had misheard. But the boy repeated, louder this time, "No more." The decree spread like fire through the empire, though of a different kind. To the oppressed it was a miracle, a whisper of change carried on trembling lips. To the powerful it was heresy, weakness that threatened the spine of rule. Plots stirred in shadowed corridors. Advisors whispered of betrayal. Generals weighed rebellion. The boy knew. He could see it in their eyes, feel it in their bowed heads. His throne was no longer secure. His crown sat upon a precipice. Yet when he lay down to sleep that night, his dreams did not echo with fire. They echoed with laughter from the training hall, with the warmth of shared bread, with the steady voice of a captain who had told him, "Fail and rise again." And for the first time, he welcomed the risk. The empire had reclaimed its child monarch. But it was not the same child they had lost. Something new had been planted within him. And though the court sought to bury it in fire and fear, the seed of change had already begun to break the stone. The trial of fire. The great hall of the empire was a cavern of glass and flame, its vaulted ceiling echoing with the steps of armored generals as they assembled beneath the boy's throne. Torchlight shimmered across banners dyed in the blood-red crest of his ancestors. This was the place where emperors had declared wars, broken vassals, and signed decrees of terror. Now, it was the place where a trembling child would stand against the tide. He sat on the throne, its carved obsidian arms stretching high above him like the jaws of some ancient beast. The crown pressed against his brow with invisible weight, heavier than before. His small hands gripped the armrests, not in command, but in anchoring himself to the moment. The generals waited, their armor glinting with polished menace. Their faces, carved by years of war, bore the sneer of men who had slaughtered to keep an empire alive. At last, one stepped forward, a towering figure with a scar like lightning across his cheek. "Your Radiance," the general began, voice thick with restrained contempt. "The empire has bled while you played captive among our enemies. The soldiers demand vengeance. Earth awaits your command. Shall we strike?" The court held its breath, all eyes fixed on the boy. The emperor's heart thundered in his chest. He heard his father's voice in memory, "Rule with fire. A ruler who kneels is no ruler at all." But then came Elias's voice, quiet and steady. "A ruler is not measured by fear. A ruler serves." And in that chasm between voices, the boy made his choice. Slowly, painfully, he rose from the throne. His knees shook. His crown slid slightly on his head. He stepped down the obsidian stairs, each step echoing like thunder in the silence. When he reached the bottom, he did not raise his hand in command. He did not summon the roar of authority. He knelt. A gasp tore through the hall, sharp as a blade. Never, never in all the centuries of the empire had an emperor bent the knee to his own court. The boy's voice rang out, soft yet steady. You ask for vengeance. I ask for mercy. No more children will starve under my name. No more worlds will burn for my crown. If you call this weakness, so be it. But if you seek strength, look here. It takes more strength to kneel than to command. The generals shifted uneasily. Their hands twitched toward their blades, but none dared move. The sight of their emperor on his knees was not weakness. It was something more dangerous. It was defiance of a different kind. The courtiers murmured in disbelief. The servants wept silently, though they dared not lift their heads. And somewhere in the shadows of the hall a guard whispered, "He kneels for us." The scarred general stepped closer, towering above the boy. His voice dropped to a growl. Your father ruled with fire. He crushed stars to dust. And you would undo his legacy with this? He gestured furiously at the boy kneeling before him. The emperor raised his chin. His eyes, no longer wide with fear, burned with something deeper. My father ruled with fire. I will rule with light. It was madness. It was heresy. It was the first true act of his reign, and the hall trembled beneath it. Some generals spat in disgust, vowing to never bow to a child who would not burn his enemies. But others hesitated. Behind their steel, behind their scars, they saw not weakness, but conviction. The seed Elias had planted was sprouting. That night, the empire split. Whispers spread of the emperor who knelt, who spoke not of conquest, but of mercy. In the outer provinces, the poor clung to these whispers as lifelines, daring to believe a new age had dawned. In the core, the warlord seethed, conspiring to unseat the boy before his softness unraveled the empire's spine. For the first time, hope and rebellion walked hand in hand. The boy returned to his chambers alone. His crown lay heavy on the table beside him, but he did not put it back on. He gazed into the mirror, seeing not a child, not a monarch, but something between, something unshaped, uncertain. I am afraid, he whispered to the empty room. But then he remembered Elias's words. Fail, and rise again, and so he resolved. He would kneel as many times as it took, even if fire consumed him for it. The trial of fire had begun. The empire was no longer whole. It was a fracture, glowing and dangerous, with the boy emperor at its heart, fragile, trembling, yet burning with a light no war could extinguish. The empire trembled on the edge of fracture. For weeks after the boy's kneeling decree, the air within the palace was heavy with whispers. Generals gathered in secret halls speaking of rebellion. Courtiers sharpened their tongues like daggers, waiting for a slip, a falter, a sign of weakness they could use to drag him from the throne. And yet, beyond the palace walls, something else stirred. Farmers whispered of bread delivered freely to their villages. Mothers told of soldiers who laid down whips when they heard the emperor's new law. Children, for the first time in generations, dreamed not of fire but of light. The empire had never been so divided and never so alive. Then came the envoy from Earth. A single vessel, unarmed, pierced the stars and docked at the imperial station under banners of white. On its hull shone no threat, only a plea. And from it stepped not an army but a delegation. Men and women weary from war, led by one familiar figure, Captain Elias Ren. The boy emperor stood at the threshold of the great hall when Elias entered. He was taller than the boy remembered, or perhaps the boy was simply smaller beneath the weight of his crown. Their eyes met, and for a moment no words passed. The silence was enough. The court murmured in outrage. Generals bristled at the sight of a human walking freely in the heart of their empire. But the emperor raised a hand, silencing them. This man, he said, his voice carrying through the chamber, did not break me. He taught me. He did not shame me. He showed me another way. And today he comes not as an enemy, but as a bridge. The negotiations began. They were long, fraught with suspicion. Imperial warlords snarled at every suggestion. Human envoys bristled at every hesitation. For days the palace rang with arguments, threats, and ultimatums. But through it all the boy held fast, not as a ruler of fire, but as a voice of light. He reminded both sides of the blood that had already been spilled, of children buried in both soils, of futures that could not survive another century of war. And when tempers flared to breaking, He did what no emperor before him had done. He stepped down from the throne and knelt once more, this time not before his own court, but between the two delegations. "If peace requires me to bow," he said, "then I will bow until my knees break." The words silenced the hall. Even the warlords, so hardened by conquest, could not meet the steady gaze of their boy emperor. At last the first treaty was signed. Fragile, imperfect, little more than a thread between two fractured worlds, but a thread strong enough to hold if both chose to believe. It was called the Dawn Accord, and in its signing, Earth and Empire took their first steps, not as conqueror and conquered, but as neighbors daring to imagine coexistence. That night, the boy stood with Elias in the gardens of the palace. The air smelled of strange blossoms that opened only beneath starlight. For once there were no attendants, no courtiers, no generals. "Only a child and a captain. Will they follow me?" the boy asked quietly. Elias studied him for a long moment, the torchlight flickering across his weathered face. "Some will. Some will fight you until their last breath. But that is not what matters. Then what does? That you choose to lead anyway." The boy's hands tightened at his sides. His crown felt heavy, his robes suffocating, yet his heart, though still afraid, beat with something it had never known before. Not command, not fear, but resolve. As dawn broke across the Empire's skies, light spilling over the horizon in a blaze of crimson and gold, the child emperor stepped onto the balcony before his people. His voice, still young, still fragile, carried across the city like a bell. "We were taught to rule with fire. Today I say we must learn to live with light. Peace will not be easy. It will not be quick. But it will begin with us." And below, in the vast ocean of citizens gathered in the streets, a sound rose like thunder. Not the chant of fear, not the roar of conquest, but something new, something fragile and trembling. Hope. Elias departed soon after, returning to Earth with the treaty in hand. But he left knowing his true legacy was not written in the accord, nor in the ruins of war, but in the heart of a boy he once fed simple bread and water. The child monarch remained, no longer merely an heir to ashes, but a flame of a different kind, fragile, flickering, yet fierce enough to hold back the dark. And though his empire still bristled with enemies, though rebellion still smoldered in hidden corners, the boy no longer trembled, for he had learned the greatest secret of leadership, that sometimes the strongest crown is the one that kneels. Thus ended the age of fire, and thus began the first dawn of light.